The Cleaners and Outcasts are very similar groups in terms of their origin, structure, weapons and technology, tactics and fighting style. They each utilise an arsenal of homemade weapons and mercilessly kill anyone and everyone who is against them, and both were born through tragedy their leaders faced after the death of loved ones. But what would happen if they were pitted up against each other, and who would come out on top? Not long after the green poison found its way into Washington, D.C., the JTF set up a quarantine on Roosevelt Island. The sick were brought here to give them a greater chance of receiving the medical treatment they needed, but also to assist in stopping the spread of the virus. They were completely reliant on personnel on the outside of the gates, and so they trusted and believed that everything they needed would be provided. However, they also had no comprehension or awareness of what was happening off the island, and the JTF officer in charge of quarantine and watching over the people on the island was a colonel by the name of Antoine Ridgway. Now Ridgway could see what was happening on both sides, as he witnessed firsthand the sick get sicker and their numbers increasing. And outside of Roosevelt Island, he observed the security forces quickly losing control of Washington, D.C. A new society was on the brink of collapse. As resources going to Roosevelt Island started to decline, Ridgway decided enough was enough. The government was losing control of the city. The sick were obviously a lost cause, and everyone's priorities needed to change drastically. So Ridgway ordered to cease all supplies from entering the quarantine zone. No more food, water, or medicine was to be administered. He was leaving them to starve to death. And so unsurprisingly, over time, these people, starving and running out of options, decided to come together and work out a solution on how to overthrow their captives and escape the island. They began to notice a reduction in guard activity and decided it was the time to act upon it. Rallying a number of people from within the quarantine community, an individual named Emmeline Shaw successfully managed to generate an uprising capable of overthrowing their captors, and they called themselves the Outcasts. Abandoned by the people who had sworn to protect them and rallied by the brilliant persuasiveness of their new leader Shaw, these survivors became united in their quest for survival and bent on revenge against those who had wronged them. As their numbers grew, so did their influence over others, and in time they were able to convince many others to take up arms and join their cause. With everyone feeling empowered and finally free of the shackles put in place by the government, Shaw increased her messages on the current situation they were all in, how they were on their own, how the government left them to die, and how everyone else in society just sat back and let it happen. Any one of those people could have made a stand and fought for them, but they didn't, and therefore they are just as guilty as the government. It was also around this time that Shaw found out that she is a rare asymptomatic carrier of the virus, and while she doesn't suffer from the side effects of the virus, she still carries it within her body, and it can be easily transmitted to others. This news only further enhanced the cult-like behaviour of the group that was starting to form around her, but more importantly to them, it provided the Outcasts with a new weapon they could use in their mission to create havoc in Washington, D.C. Their goal? To spread the dollar flu throughout the healthy citizens of the city. The Cleaners originated as the blue-collar workers of New York City. Janitors, sanitation, garbage men, electrician, construction workers, truck drivers. These were the people that the government initially asked to assist them in saving the city through transport, digging of mass graves, and eventually the construction of the wall that would surround the quarantine zone. These were the groups that continued to support the civil services, even when the city infrastructure was breaking down. Unfortunately, these are also some of the people that were left behind when the JTF and government pulled out of the dark zone. And much like the first wave of division agents, these men were left feeling betrayed and abandoned. It was at this point that an individual by the name of Joe Ferro stepped up and organised these abandoned workers into a force that would do anything that was needed to contain the virus and restore order to the streets of New York City. Ferro's wife was one of the first victims to become infected and shortly after succumbed to the virus. With his wife dead, he continued to think that the government wasn't doing anything to really stop the virus, and he believed that no one had stepped up and was brave enough to do anything about it. With all of his faith in the government lost, he decided to take matters into his own hands. So he assembled the people who had worked alongside the JTF and the government before they left. He proceeded to tell them that there was now only one way to stop the virus. Burn it. Burn all of it. Burn every trace of it. And thus, the Cleaners were born. They believe that they are the true heroes fighting against the virus on the front lines. They're the ones leaving everything they had behind, just so they could stay in New York and do what has to be done. The Cleaners are devoted to their job, and if anyone gets in the way, they're a part of the problem and are swiftly dealt to. Comprised mostly of untrained civilians, over time they have managed to organise themselves into a force that could almost resemble an army. Both the Outcasts and the Cleaners have a number of roles within their ranks, from the assault, rushers, throwers and snipers, all the way through to the support, engineers and heavies. These two factions are structured in a very similar way, with only very minor differences between the classes. During combat, Outcasts usually behave more recklessly than other factions in the division, choosing to focus heavily on close combat and foregoing the safety of cover. Although they have a sniper role within their ranks, they are few and far between, instead relying on the crude technical, explosive and fire abilities during combat. While they are more suited to hunting and killing unarmed civilians, they have learned to be more than capable against armed, dangerous foes. Their support types can turn the tide of battle because of the fire rounds they can provide, but the tanks and scorchers support the bulk of their strategy, which in general is to pin the targets down with suppressive gunfire while the close combat specialists move into position. The Cleaners are skilled in guerrilla warfare and are particularly good with utilising whatever they find to build weapons and technology. Their tactics are aggressive and focus on coordinated offensives. While the assaults and rushes are found on the front lines, constantly keeping the enemy off balance and unable to establish a solid position, the engineers, controllers and tanks are found closely behind at medium range, keeping them locked down and unable to regroup. The assault class will usually pin targets down while another rushes up to them to set them alight from behind. The thrower role's job is very similar. Any target choosing to take cover will quickly be pinned down using flame and gas grenades, while rushers and flamers move up to finish the job. Much like the Outcasts, the Cleaners are less of a concern at range. They have snipers, but due to the lack of training throughout their forces, their numbers are low. However, the more recent addition of the napalm turret should not be underestimated. Their range is long, and can quickly overwhelm if left unchecked. Both factions were established due to the chaos that unfolded following the dollar flu outbreak, predominantly consisting of civilian personnel with little to no military experience or training. They more than make up for this with numbers and a strong passion to do what they believe is right. One through revenge, and one through the necessity to fill a gap that they believe is lacking from official agencies. Although lacking in experience, their time over the many months since the outbreak has seen them each develop tactics and strategy that even the most disciplined force would struggle to counter. Both factions can be seen wielding various types of assault rifles, LMGs, marksman rifles, SMGs, and shotguns. However, most of these have been acquired from foes they have taken down, and they have no real experience and training behind them. The bulk of their weapons are homemade, from the chem launchers and flamethrowers, to the remote control cars with saw blades attached, and drones that drop firebombs. Regarding their technology, these two groups are quite evenly matched. The only real difference between them is the Outcasts' use of the virus itself. While the Cleaners wish to destroy it, the Outcasts would only like to see it spread. The Cleaners and Outcasts are very similar in their origins, structure, technology, weapons, tactics, and fighting style. Both utilise homemade weapons and mercilessly kill anyone and everyone who is against them, and both were brought to be through leaders after the death of their loved ones. The Cleaners were assembled in an attempt to save the city. Unfortunately, their misguided methods had them set on a more brutal, genocidal path. The Outcasts came to be through an individual who was stricken by grief, who also happened to be charismatic and able to work on people's vulnerabilities in order to have them follow her beliefs. However, their goals are very different. While the Cleaners seek to eradicate the virus through fire, the Outcasts instead seek to spread the virus and kill those who allowed them to suffer. The Outcasts, as their name suggests, see themselves as having been cast aside by society, and in turn have reacted through becoming brutal, merciless murderers who prey on the innocent who are simply trying to survive. Both have learned to fight in a manner that overcomes their lack of tactical training, by providing constant offensive pressure, never allowing the opposing force to be able to gain traction or gather their bearings. If those who come up against them are able to resist the initial rush, things will quickly go downhill for each of the factions. Their numbers are similar, both from their initial uprisings and the number of sympathizers that have joined their ranks since. So I believe that in a situation where both of these groups were to come up against each other, that they would almost be in a stalemate. Almost. While they each fight for a cause that they believe is well deserved, one in particular stands out and could easily drive the fight in their favour. Although a single battle would likely see no obvious winner, the long-term goal of one is likely to come out on top. As much as this pains me to say, due to the other faction being my favourite within the Division universe, I see the Outcasts as having the edge in this fight. They may be matched in weaponry, training, and numbers, and they also each have the unwavering drive to complete what has been put in front of them. But the Outcasts have a little something extra. Crazy. And we all know, you don't mess with crazy. The Outcasts have grown into a somewhat cult-type group, all based on the ramblings of the charismatic leader, Emmeline Shaw. And although she has finally been brought down by the Division, this has only made her following fight that much harder for the legacy she has left behind. And while the Cleaners are well aware of what they're putting themselves into, the Outcasts are willing to go that much further to achieve their goals. Death isn't a problem to them, it's almost a goal, a way to show how devoted they are. This psychological aspect alone is likely to tip the tide of the Cleaner Outcast battle. They are simply willing to go further and more out there to get on top. What the Cleaners are likely to see as being too far probably doesn't even register on the Outcast moral compass. While they have all lost loved ones and decided to take it upon themselves to make things right, the Outcasts have lost a little more of themselves to this conflict and are willing to do that much more to serve their new family, regardless of how much of their humanity they have to leave behind. Following on from the last Versus video, there seemed to be a bit of interest, and I've kind of wanted to make some of these on the factions for quite some time now, but I never got around to it, so hopefully you enjoyed this. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers!